Some towns have secrets. Other towns are the secret. Welcome to Blackwood Creek. On the surface, it's a picture-perfect community. Manicured lawns, quiet streets, friendly neighbors. But beneath the soil, something has been rotting for a very long time. On a freezing October morning in 1994, the silence of this town was shattered forever. Not by a gunshot, not by a scream in the night, but by the sickening crunch of a sledgehammer hitting metal behind a false wall. This is the story of the Copper Box Killer. A case so deeply disturbing, so thoroughly buried, that the investigators who worked it refuse to speak of it to this day. It started with the Miller family. They had just purchased the old Holloway house at the end of Elm Street. It had sat empty for nearly a decade. The locals whispered that the house had bad bones, but the Millers just saw a cheap renovation project. Mr. Miller was in the basement, tearing down what he thought was a water-damaged partition. Behind the drywall, he found a hollow cavity. Inside that cavity was a box, made entirely of heavy, oxidized copper. It was welded completely shut. There were no hinges, no locks, just solid metal. And seeping from the microscopic cracks in the welds was an odor that made Mr. Miller drop his hammer and run for the stairs. When the Blackwood Creek police arrived, they didn't know what they were dealing with. It took the fire department an hour to cut through the heavy copper with a blowtorch. What they found inside haunts those first responders to this day. The box contained the remains of Sarah Jenkins. She was a local librarian who had vanished without a trace 3 years earlier. Everyone assumed she had simply packed up and moved away in the middle of the night. But Sarah never left Blackwood Creek. She was sealed inside the walls of the Holloway house. But Sarah's remains weren't the most terrifying part of the discovery. Clutched in the victim's hands was a piece of heavy parchment. It didn't burn from the blowtorch. On it was a message. It wasn't written in English. It was a cipher, a complex sequence of coordinates, dates, and strange archaic symbols. Lead detective Marcus Thorne, a veteran investigator who thought he had seen it all, took one look at the paper and felt his blood run cold. He brought in cryptologists from the state capital. It took them 2 weeks to crack the code. When they finally translated the message, the investigation completely changed. This wasn't a murder case anymore. It was a countdown. The translated code revealed 5 specific geographic coordinates within the town limits of Blackwood Creek. Detective Thorne pinned each location on a map in his office. When he stepped back, he realized the 5 pins formed a perfect, mathematically precise pentagon. And sitting exactly in the dead center of that shape was the Holloway house. But the nightmare was just beginning. Beside each coordinate was a date. The remaining 4 dates weren't from the past. They were in the future. The killer had planned his next moves years in advance, and the second date on the list was only exactly 48 hours away. Panic set in behind closed doors. The police had 48 hours to find a ghost. They started tearing into the town's history, looking at everyone connected to the Holloway house. Their first suspect was the next-door neighbor, Elias. Elias was a recluse. He never spoke to anyone, kept his windows boarded up, and had a disturbing habit of digging deep trenches. When questioned, Elias just stared at the detectives with blank, unblinking eyes, repeating the same phrase, "The soil is hungry." But despite his terrifying demeanor, Elias had a rock-solid alibi for the time of Sarah Jenkins' disappearance. He had been locked up in the county jail for a noise violation. If it wasn't Elias, who was it? Detective Thorne's attention turned inward. The town sheriff, a man named Brody, had been suspiciously eager to close the Sarah Jenkins case. Thorne began digging into the sheriff's financial records. He found massive, unexplained cash deposits made the very same week Sarah went missing. Was the town's top law enforcement officer being blackmailed by a serial killer? Or was he the Copper Box Killer himself? Thorne didn't have time to find out. The 48 hours were up. The target was a small, unassuming ranch house on the edge of town. Thorne and his team quietly evacuated them under the cover of darkness. By 10 p.m., the house was a fortress. SWAT operators were hidden in the tree line. Snipers were on the neighboring roofs. Thorne and his partner, Detective Miller, sat in an unmarked surveillance van across the street, watching the monitors. They had every angle covered. They waited in the suffocating silence. At exactly 12:01 a.m., the radio completely died. Just static. Thorne tapped the microphone, calling for the perimeter team. No answer. Suddenly, the van lost power. The monitors went pitch black. Thorne grabbed his flashlight and turned to his partner. Miller was slumped over the control panel. A single freshly minted copper coin was on his eyelid. Thorne drew his weapon. He hadn't heard a door open. He hadn't heard a footstep. The killer had slipped past a dozen armed officers without making a single sound. In the basement of the target house, exactly where the coordinates indicated, they found the second copper box. It was sitting perfectly in the center of the room. When they cut it open, they didn't find a body. They found an old-fashioned cassette tape recorder. Thorne put on gloves and pressed play. The tape hissed for a few seconds. Then, a voice began to speak. Thorne froze. The color drained from his face. It wasn't a distorted voice. It was his own voice. The tape was playing a recording of an argument Thorne had had with his wife in his own kitchen just 3 hours earlier. The killer had been inside Thorne's house. He had been listening to his most private moments. He was proving that no one was safe, no fortress was secure, and no lock could keep him out. The investigation completely unraveled after that night. Thorne suffered a nervous breakdown and resigned from the force. Sheriff Brody was indicted on unrelated corruption charges. Elias was found dead in one of his own backyard trenches a year later. The copperbox killer simply vanished back into the shadows. Years turned into decades. The remaining 3 dates on the map came and went without a single incident. It was as if the killer had grown bored and moved on. The case went ice cold. 10 years later, a letter arrived at the Blackwood Creek police station. Inside was a small brass key and the final piece of the cipher. It led investigators to a bank vault 300 miles away. The new lead detective turned the lock. He pulled the metal drawer out, expecting answers, expecting a confession, expecting the identity of the monster who broke their town. The box was completely empty, save for 2 items. An antique hand mirror, its glass cracked down the middle, and underneath it, a small card. It read, "We only see what we want to see. Look behind you." The detective spun around, drawing his weapon, but the vault was empty. Just the cold walls and the silence. The copperbox killer was never identified. To this day, the Holloway house stands entirely abandoned. No one will buy it. No one will even walk past it at night. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the dead trees of Blackwood Creek, locals swear they can hear the faint, metallic sound of a sledgehammer hitting a copper wall. The killer won his game. He proved that true evil doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it wears the face of a neighbor, a friend, or the shadows themselves. What do you think happened in Blackwood Creek? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching. Alex.